We're getting ready to start our unit on speculative fiction. This is a broad literary genre encompassing any fiction with supernatural, fantastical, or futuristic elements. This includes fantasy, dystopia, and science fiction novels. When we talk about speculative fiction, these three distinct categories in turquoise stand out as the main genres. Underneath them are subgenres. Some people argue that dystopia is a subgenre of either fantasy or science fiction, depending on the particular details of the story. But a lot of people say that it's its own category within speculative fiction, and that's how we're going to handle it. There are lots more subgenres than the ones listed here, and we're not going to go into depth about all of these, but we're going to briefly define them. So in fantasy, we have high or epic fantasy. So this is the hero's quest and journey. It's a it's a journey story. Fairy tales are things that you're very familiar with. Disney has made $1 million on every fairy tale that they've cranked out as a cartoon, but in YA lit, they're retold in a certain way. So they're fairy tales, but they're retold in a more adult or twisted ending. Dark fantasy is also a form of fantasy horror. Portal fantasy is where there's a portal or an object that allows a main character to go from one reality to another. Historical fantasy speculates about what was happening as with fantasy elements in a historic time period. So it has elements of historic fiction, but it has fantastical elements that classify it as a fantasy. Mythology gods and demons are based on mythologies from around the world or mythologies that are created by the writer. Sword and sorcery has to do with magic. Harry Potter would fall into that category. Superheroes tend to be covered more in comics and graphic novels than in YA novels, but there are some YA novel adaptations about superheroes. Paranormal romance, we already covered in the romance genre video, but if there is a supernatural character, a fantasy element, it also falls technically within fantasy as well. Magical Girl flips the script on a damsel in distress who needs to be rescued by a hero and empowers the girl with special powers that she is learning to master in order to solve her own problems. Contemporary fantasy would be a story that is set in our world today as we know it, but has fantasy elements to it. So, an example of this would be A Blade So Black, which is the retelling of Alice in Wonderland with an African American teen living in Atlanta, Georgia. And that also overlaps portal fantasy because she can go to Wonderland through a portal. So that covers fantasy and some of the most popular subgenres. All of these genres can have elements of humor, adventure, romance, mystery, or horror, and frequently do. In science fiction, there are several subgenres beyond the ones listed here, but these are the most common. In a parallel universe, there are two universes, and sometimes the main character can go from one to the other, or sometimes what happens in one universe impacts the other universe. In alternate history, this is speculation about what would happen if a certain invention or technology had been present at a historical time period, how that would have changed history. Cyberpunk is a category that might be a word you haven't heard of before, but as soon as I read the definition, you are going to be able to connect it to something you have seen. This is a subgenre of science fiction that incorporates our concern about the future impact of advanced technologies, especially cybernetics, bionics, genetic engineering, and the designer drug culture upon the individual, who is competing with the increasing power and control of the multinational corporations that are extending their stranglehold on the world's supply of information. I'm certain that you've seen at least one of them on Netflix. Wild adventure or techno thriller is also sometimes called a space opera, and Star Wars falls into that category. Space exploration and aliens is pretty straightforward as well. You know what that involves. So those are subgenres within these 3 branches of speculative fiction.